Hello guys, today we'll have a code review of a repository based on Vue.js and Laravel API. I received an email by a person who asked to make a review, and since I have a bit more free time these days, I agreed to do that. And in this video, step by step, we will get through the code. So you will learn something about how Laravel APIs work, some improvements about Eloquent, code structure, and just random tips. The project itself is quite small. I will show you that in a browser. This is the website. This is in language that I don't understand, but I operate with URLs and endpoints, and I can guess that this URL is login. And by seeders, I know that the login is admin. We click enter, and then we are in, and there are some menu items, /buildings, /extinguishers, pages, user profile, settings, contacts, and add a new contact. And it's a simple form, so we can add something with fake filler Chrome extension, and it's good. Then we have notes. So basically it's like 5 features grouped into menu items, and this is all Laravel API, but the front end is Vue.js calling that Laravel API. So this is how it works. Now how it is written in the code. First, the installation part. It's really good that we have README file with instruction how to install. I would improve that a bit because after passport install, the client ID, it says paste it here, but paste where exactly? Into README? It should be pasted into .env file. Into here, so README file should mention the .env file, and I found that out by looking at env.example, which is great again that we do have the example, but if you do write README, try to make it as clear as possible. Great thing about installation actually, is that the repository have the seeders, really good seeders for dummy data or semi-real data with permissions, roles, users, profile, and some data. So I know, so if we go to user seeder, as a first-time installer, I already know that there's admin user, there's user with role ID 2, and a few users with role ID 3, which I can log in with and look at some data. So seeders are really important for people who haven't written that code and haven't seen that, but want to run that for the first time. So that's great. Now, if we take a look at the structure of that repository, there's Vue.js part in resources.js with components, and then it calls the API part of Laravel, which is in app HTTP controllers, API controllers. I won't stop too much on the Vue.js part because that would require a separate video, but I will give you an overview how it works. So you should take a look at resources.js, router.js, and there are a list of components that are being used. So buildings, pages, notes, contacts, and similar stuff that I've shown you visually in the URLs. And those components are related in resources.js views, and then folder by folder. For example, we go to buildings index.vue. There's the HTML part with the table, and then down below it should be calling, here we go, Axios get buildings. Similar, for example, if we go to contacts create view, it's a form with fields, and at the bottom in Vue.js we call post of contacts, and then show success message or catch errors. For the authentication part, this project uses Laravel Passport. Personally, I think that Passport is kind of an overkill. As soon as Laravel Sanctum was released, this is the one that I do recommend for especially smaller projects like this one. So to use Laravel Passport, you need to have reasons to have that auth 2 and pretty complex scenario. Then you could use Passport. Otherwise, I would suggest Sanctum instead. But it works here really well. And in the routes API of Laravel PHP, all you need to do to enable Passport is have a middleware auth API. And everything here is protected by Laravel Passport, basically. So now let's go deeper into API resources and API controllers of Laravel and see the code. First, let's take a look at the controller called contact controller to manage contacts. And the first line in the index, I see this: abort if user can or cannot, then we have a separate error message. And here I have a few comments. First, instead of doing this, you could use this authorize with that gate. This is a gate defined in auth service provider. I will get to that in a minute. But what I wanted to show you is alternative thing, which also exists in the same repository. This authorize is doing the same thing. So if you have some gate defined and you want to check the permission, you can call this authorize, and in case of failure, it would just return 403 forbidden. Otherwise, if you want to customize the message, then you can do it like this. So abort if that fails, abort with 403, same forbidden, and then you can customize the message. But actually, there's another way to still use this authorize here. So this authorize show message. It's much shorter, right? But then you lose that error message. So where you can define that? Let's take a look where the gates are defined at all. In auth service provider, in boot method, we have the permissions transformed into gates. So in database, there is a permission table seated with these permissions. So name and description, and then in the auth service provider, we get the permissions and then define the gates for every permission with function of user model has allow, something like this, which is okay as you define gate. But did you know that you can define messages here as well? So in the Laravel documentation, there's a section called gate responses. So while defining the gate, you can return true or false. So in our case, it would be return user has allow response, access response allow. Otherwise, let's move it a bit here. I'm doing a bit of live coding here. Response deny with the message, and that message could come from the permission. So I would see the messages for every permission here in the database as a new database field, and then move them here. And in the controller, then all you need to do is use this authorize without performing the message manipulation here. It's a bit shorter for controllers. Also, small detail, I don't really like the ability of show message, which isn't related to contact controller. It should be something like view contacts or edit contacts or something like that. And in general, permissions in this database are quite cool. So add stuff, delete stuff, edit stuff, good. But show message is kind of out of context and it's not really clear. So imagine a new developer coming here, looking at show message, and they're kind of confused and lost. Show what message? What is the permission for contacts? So to avoid confusing other developers, name things as they should be named, something like view contacts or something like that. Okay, let's move on through that controller. So we get all the contacts, that's cool. And then we have this respond. What is this respond? And here we land in a controller, which is API controller, which is the main controller for all API responses. And this is the thing I quite liked. So in all the API controllers, it extends not just regular controller of Laravel, it extends that API controller, which in turn extends the main controller. So the developer provides the status codes and respond not found, respond this, respond that as a shorter way to respond from any controller. It makes the controllers shorter and even more readable. So this respond, just respond, but if we move down, there's respond created, respond not found, and other methods of API controller, which makes the other controllers readable. Good. Now let's take a look at that contact resource. It's an API resource. It was released in Laravel 5.5 to manipulate the API response from Laravel. And in here, a few fields are just the same without any formatting, but isRead is a function of contact model. So if we take a look at contact here, there's a scope isRead and then scope created at, So isRead and created at are actually scopes. And in this case, I disagree with that implementation. So scope is not for formatting the fields. Apparently it works this way, but scope is basically for Laravel queries to add additional query where or query condition. But instead of having scope isRead and scope created at, they should be attributes. So get isRead attribute. It's called accessors and mutators in Laravel, and similar here, get created at attribute. And in this case, it's even worse actually. So get is red attribute then becomes is underscore red here. So it's not a function anymore. So this is red. Here we have camel case. Here we have snake case. And for created add, I don't really understand why the formatting of the created add happens here and why we need the attribute or the model for that. We could do this created add format here. Why not? And then we don't override the default created add. So then we can remove that function altogether. Also, small thing, why use is at the bottom. It should be on top usually. Small detail. So yeah, Laravel accessors and mutators is a pretty common topic, and I will link in the description below where you can read about them in the official Laravel documentation. Let's see what else do we have in the contact controller store method. User ID is added to the validated array, and I think this is not necessary. So user ID is logged in user or null. I think by default, if I'm not mistaken, if you just put auth ID here, it would automatically return null if the user is not logged in. So we save a few lines of code and unnecessary variable. Next thing I wanted to discuss is the pagination in another controller called building controller. I see a query happening to get the buildings, which is cool, and then paginate of Laravel, which is cool, but then we have a separate buildings count and pass two variables, the count of all the buildings and then the data for the collection. Instead of doing that, so there's a package called Laravel Vue Pagination. I've used it myself a few times, and it makes it really easy to work with pagination provided by default Laravel. So all you need to do basically is to load the pagination component of Vue.js. Unfortunately, I can't show it quickly in this repository because that would take a lot of time to change. But generally, if you work with Vue.js and pagination and Laravel API, this is the package that I would recommend. Next, in the same building controller, we have a show method, and here I see double check, which isn't needed. So we use route model binding, which is querying the data by itself, and then we're checking if there's no building, we return response not found with the message. Actually, if there's no building, this would fire 404 error before this happening. So let me show you. In the buildings list, I've opened the list, and then we have the list of network requests here. And look what happens if I click some buildings. There's a slug URL. It's not ID, but it's cool. It works. And we have that building returned. It's cool. But if I manage to do something like this, look what happens. That thing returns 404, but it doesn't contain any of that message of this one. It's default 404 by Laravel, no query results for the model, and as a result, there's no error here, it's just empty data. So two things here basically. First, if you want to override this response, probably you should not use route model binding, and also on the Vue.js part, so resources, JS, views, buildings, show view. In the show, we have the request to get that building, and here we don't have any kind of catch. So then response, we get the data, but also if there is 404, it should not be an empty page here because the user isn't informed what actually happened. Instead, we should do catch here and process the error response. And in fact, we do have examples of catch here in this project, so .catch is quite good here. So catch error, we add the errors, and errors are in the validation messages somewhere, or in another example, for example, error is just console log, which is quite meaningless if you ask me, but still it's something. It at least catches the error. Next, if we scroll down through that building controller, I want to show you a good example and a bad example of managing the building. So look here, store the building, we abort, again, same thing as we discussed, and then building create with request validated. So all the validation happens in the form request class, which is great. So we have validation rules, and then we can safely have request validated here instead of request all, which is insecure, and request validated is the way to go. But look what happens in the update method. It should be done really similarly in a similar way, but instead of that, the developer is assigning a lot of variables, a lot of properties, instead of reusing that update building request. I haven't tested it, but it should be something like request update, building update with request validated plus whatever else we want. So plus checked at is null, or in fact checked at is defined later with if-else statement. And we have not just building update, but building update with attributes plus checked at equals checked at variable, for example. And let me finish that refactoring. So basically here, instead of building checked at, we would have a separate variable checked at like this, and then assign that as additional parameter to the request validated. So we assign checked at as null in the very beginning, and then perform some if statements, and I've replaced them all, and also we don't need that else statement because it's null by default. So something like this. So we shortened that controller, we reused request validated as in store, and I haven't tried it, but I think that would work. A few more controllers to take a look at. Next one is extinguisher controller. And what I wanted to show you is this method, get extinguishers type. This query is not really optimized for performance. Quite an often mistake that I see in junior developers code. I'm not saying that this developer is junior, but in general with people who didn't really work with Eloquent, they do a lot something like this. So get all the data and then perform whatever operations they want. In this case, there are not a lot of extinguishers in the database, so this query would be still fast. But if you do that with thousands of queries, you query the data, you get all the 1,000 rows, and then you get only something that you actually need in Eloquent collections. Instead of doing that, you should select only things that you need. And from what I understand, we need distinct of type. So I'm not entirely sure, but this should work. Select raw of distinct type and then pluck type, I think. I'm not entirely sure. You should maybe try it out. But my main thing is make the database work. The distinction for you is from the SQL, from MySQL. It should come, and then you query only the data that you actually need. Then if we go to the store method of the same controller, it is inconsistent with another controller which we just took a look at. And in general, after looking at like 5 or 7 controllers, I realized there's quite a lot of inconsistency over all that project, over all that repositories. In one place we use request validated, in another place we're assigning the variables, third place we're populating the array and then doing save. And in this case it doesn't really even make much sense. So we're creating the new model object. That building extinguisher is an Eloquent model, simple model, nothing really fancy here. And then we're checking if. So in what case that would be false? I don't even imagine, to be honest. So instead of all of that, what we should be doing is building extinguisher, create request validated, and then return this response created like this. So 2 lines of code. And the validation should happen inside of that request, which it does, required. Cool. So in general, that repository, that project lacks a bit of consistency in different places. Maybe some of the code was written previously when that developer was still learning and maybe they didn't come back to fix the old code. That's my assumption. But in whatever case, if you provide the code for review, whether it's my review, your colleague's review, or you launch something, consistency is quite important. And speaking of consistency, there should be consistency between the name of the methods and what that methods actually do. So for example, restore method of extinguishing controller, what it does, it's actually deleting stuff. So with restore, I would expect something like soft deletes with trashed and then restore, but not the case. Restore actually means delete. So that's quite a fun part. I'm not sure how to comment that, but just restore should restore records and delete should delete records. As simple as that. Okay, we're almost at the end. A few more things that I wanted to show you in this repository. So user controller is basically for managing your own profile. And here we have this. Again, quite an often situation where I see that people are querying the user from the database from the logged in user. In fact, all you need to do is use auth user, which is provided to you at all times. If you have the session, you don't have to do find by auth ID. what you probably need to do is profile and buildings. So you want to load them, right? What you can do is in the profile resource, it actually is already used here, this profile and this building. So I'm not even sure whether you need to load those. I understand the eager loading is important, but if you query one user, it will anyway have one query for that user for get the profile and get the buildings. So for that, I would just do something like this. Again, I haven't tested it, but it should work. And also down below, again, we're querying auth user. That is better, of course, but you don't need to have a special variable. So auth user password could be here, then user password, again, auth user save. So you don't need to have a variable for user specifically. You can use auth user here or in Blade files if it's not API project. So you have the user object wherever you need that. Another thing I've noticed here is that in that user controller, they don't use the API controller methods. So in other controllers, we have respond not found, respond created, respond this and that. In this case, we're returning the message. Why not? Again, inconsistency. I'm not sure. Maybe that part of Vue.js requires the message to have it in a certain way, but this respond should also work, I think. So basically, if you have some common functions, use them everywhere. Because, for example, again, you have a new developer working on user controller, for example, and they didn't see other controllers, and they continue with inconsistent responses without even looking at this respond method existing. And then that repository becomes even more inconsistent and has a bigger probability of bugs even. So I'm not sure if I repeated the word consistency enough in this repository, but I think you get the idea. And that's it. That's all I wanted to show you. That's all I found in this repository. Something interesting, both bad things and good things. I hope it was helpful for that developer himself and for you guys watching this video. If you want more code reviews on this channel, suggest what do I need to review. Maybe it's your code, maybe it's some repository open sourced online on GitHub. Give your suggestions in the comments below or email me directly, pavelis@laraveldaily.com. And if you want to support my mission of these daily videos and reviews, you can check out one of the 3 products that you can see on the screen now. It's Quick Admin Panel Generator for Laravel Admin Panels, Livewire Kit set of components, and set of my courses on Teachable. Finally, subscribe to the channel to get new videos, and see you guys in those other videos.